Welcome to the first session of this symposium. I am pleased to introduce the chair of this event, Dr. Jack Hunter, who will present Deep Weird, the Phenomenology of High Strangeness, where he will discuss the academic aversion to the most unusual forms of extraordinary experiences, including OBEs, UFOs, voice hearing, encounters with light, religious experience, fairy sightings, and so on, suggesting that a sense of high strangeness might well be a core underlying feature of extraordinary experience. Dr. Hunter is a research fellow with the Parapsychology Foundation and an honorary research fellow with the Alister Religious Experience Research Center. He is also a tutor with the Sophia Centre for the Study of Cosmology and Culture, University of Wales Trinity Saint David, and the Alef Trust's MSc in Consciousness, Spirituality, and Transpersonal Psychology. In 2010, he founded Paranthropology, Journal of the Anthropological Approaches to the Paranormal, and he is the author of Spirits, Gods, and Magic, Manifesting Spirits, and is editor of Mattering the Invisible, Greening the Paranormal, Damned Facts, and Talking with the Spirits. Thanks for joining us, Jack. Please begin your presentation.
Deep Weird. Yeah, this is my presentation. It's really just to set the scene. This whole symposium has emerged out of a book project that I've been working on for about a year and a half now, an edited book called Deep Weird, the varieties of high strangeness experience. And I'll talk a little bit more about the book later on. But the basic idea is that, experiences are bizarre. There are many, many strange experiences out there. And academics, researchers have focused on some kinds of experiences and they've ignored other kinds. But I really wanted to think about experiences and about why it is that some kinds of experiences are ignored and other kinds of experiences are kind of accepted. So this whole kind of book project emerged out of thinking about these issues. Okay, so this is what I want to talk about today. First of all, I'm going to give a short introduction. I've got quite a lot of things I want to say about this, so hopefully I'll be able to get through it all. So I'll give a very short introduction about the idea of the weird and things like that, what the weird is, and then a little bit about the history and the different strands of extraordinary experience research. The first part of the talk then will focus on the varieties of extraordinary experience. The talk riffing off William James a little bit. The second part will then focus on high strangeness, defining what high strangeness is, and beginning to think in the third part about what the phenomenological features of high strangeness might be. What is it that makes high strangeness a distinctive kind of experience, or distinctive kinds of experiences? And then the final section will briefly think about where high strangeness kind of resonates with some of the findings from parapsychology, some of the ideas in parapsychology, some of the models, and then the conclusion will take things a little bit further and to think about maybe broader ontological perspectives. Brian Bates, he was a psychologist, and he wanted to basically, through fiction, in a similar manner, like it says on the top here, in the best-selling tradition of Carlos Castaneda, through a kind of blend of fiction and non-fiction, create an image of an Anglo-Saxon worldview. Okay, and this is where this term weird comes from. And he says, in its archaic original sense, weird meant that aspect of life which was so deep, so all-pervasive, and so central to our understanding of ourselves and our world that it was inexpressible. Weird refers to our personal destiny. It connects us to all things, thoughts, emotions, events in the cosmos, as if through the threads of an enormous, invisible, but dynamic web. Okay, so this idea of the weird, this Anglo-Saxon idea of the weird, is kind of similar to what people like Evans Pritchard, the anthropologist, how he described witchcraft beliefs for the Azandi in Sudan. It's sort of like a connecting principle. Or you could even think of it in terms of, Jungian synchronicity. Okay, so weird was understood as a connecting structure, really, that linked events and it helped to explain events. Okay, but this isn't quite the way that the word weird is used today. More often, it's kind of used to refer to things like, strange things, unusual things, uncanny things. Okay, but if we go right back to the very origins of the term, then we're talking about something that has always been very deep. The weird has always been understood as something deep. Okay, so the way that I'm using it, though, is in this modern sense as referring to the uncanny, the strange, the bizarre. But also, I think it's interesting to note that this theme of an inexpressible something and of something that interconnects things continues to emerge, in contemporary weird experiences, strange experiences, and bizarre experiences as well. So even though I'm not using the old-fashioned term weird, I think it sort of still has its presence within this field. So the other sense that I'm thinking about these as deep weird is that these kinds of experiences, rather than being sort of superfluous or fluff and stuff like that, actually they might tell us something useful and important and maybe even meaningful, not just about ourselves, but also about the world of the non-human and the deep structures of reality that that old sense of the weird seemed to be hinting at. Okay, so I'm saying that these high strangeness experiences, and I'll explain this later on, might actually be useful for us in some way as researchers. They might tell us something useful. Okay, it's also important to point out that there is a very long history of research on extraordinary experience. It's something that since all of the various disciplines kind of crystallized in the 19th century, psychology, sociology, anthropology, and all those disciplines, is something that has been actually central to a lot of thinking in the academy. But it's been done in particular kinds of ways. Okay, so this is one of the first points that we want to think about here is how is it that we are approaching these issues, and how have our sort of disciplinary forebears approached these issues? So the Society for Psychical Research is one of the world's oldest organizations devoted to researching what we might call weird experiences. Okay, established in 1882, but it was building on foundations that had been slowly accumulating in the 19th century. Okay, so it was an important step, and the work of the SPR took, we'll see later on with parapsychology, a different kind of angle to other forms of research on extraordinary experience, different kind of trajectory. And then we've also got William James, who kind of bridges between these different ways of thinking about extraordinary experience. He was himself a president of the Society for Psychical Research and established the American SPR as well. But he also establishes this other tradition of thinking about extraordinary experience of within sociology and within psychology, and what would eventually emerge as like religious studies. Okay, so these are the kinds of it's this kind of religious studies approach to extraordinary experience that really becomes dominant, especially in the humanities and social sciences. And then in the 1960s, people like Alister Hardy built on this work and moved the study of extraordinary experiences, specifically religious experiences, almost into a kind of naturalistic register. They started to, because he was a naturalist himself, but to sort of catalogue and classify different kinds of extraordinary experiences like you might do with butterflies and things like that. Okay, so this is the trajectory of respectable academic research on extraordinary experiences, and it became very like I was saying, giving examples of extraordinary experiences, cataloging them, classifying them, and all of these kinds of things. And then the other trajectory that span out from psychical research was towards empirical verification of things like psi or paranormal modes of cognition. Parapsychology is tended towards laboratory-based research using quantitative methods, so numbers, statistical evidence, and all of these kinds of things to demonstrate the existence of this thing called psi, which I'll talk about later on. So this is very different to what the kind of humanities and social sciences research on extraordinary experience has been doing. which has been much more qualitative, thinking about people's experiences and things like that. This is more about trying to demonstrate or prove something. And it's collected lots of very good statistical evidence in favor of various psi phenomena, which suggests that these things, things like ESP and PK and stuff, do actually exist, even if it's only on a very small scale. But the truth is, that the statistical significance of, psi effects really pales in comparison to all sorts of paranormal and extraordinary experiences as they occur in the real world, which are often much more kind of intense, much more emotional, much more, dynamic. Okay, so these effects are so small compared to most paranormal experiences as they occur in everyday life or in people's lives, which are much more powerful and intense. This is something that the anthropologist Ernesto Di Martino pointed out way back in the 1960s. He was one of the first, not the first, but one of the first pioneers in putting together a sort of an anthropological parapsychological synthesis. And he said that in the laboratory, the drama of the dying man who appears to a relative or friend is reduced to an oft-repeated experiment, one that tries to transmit to the mind of the subject the image of a playing card chosen at random. So you can see how all of the emotion and drama and sort of overpowering, awe-inspiring nature of real-life paranormal experiences is reduced down to these statistical tests in parapsychology. Okay, so what then has happened to all of these other kinds of experiences, real-life paranormal experiences that are much more intense than psi effects documented in labs? Well, the sort of research remit for these kinds of things has fallen to usually non-academic, non-scholarly, or we could even say popular paranormal researchers. Okay, so we have, for example, Charles Fort, who we can think of as the founder of Fortean Studies. And, if you look at Charles Fort's books starting off at the very tail end of the 19th century, his approach was expansive. In fact, he even talked about the need to be inclusive in our research and not exclusive, not excluding things, but bringing in phenomena and experiences as much as possible. Okay, so for the Fortean approach, those researchers who followed on from Charles Fort have really embraced that, sprawling kind of perspective. They've not been constrained, I'd say, quite as much, but obviously there are still, there will still be influences, but they've not been constrained quite as much by dominant academic structures. So they've been able to think more freely about things, to explore lots of different possibilities, and not necessarily to be stuck to any particular model. Sorry. In fact, Charles Fort preferred not to get stuck in any particular model. He preferred to keep thinking about these phenomena rather than fixing himself in any particular framework. Other Fortean writers would be people like John Keel. He introduced lots of interesting concepts, and these might not be scientific concepts, or they might not fit in with some of the dominant views in sort of the established academic perspective on extraordinary experience, but they are based on his own empirical observations. And I think actually, we stand to learn a lot really in the academic study of extraordinary experience from taking these kinds of researchers seriously as well, their findings and conclusions. So some of John Keel's ideas were to do with, he came up with the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis. It's the idea that UFOs and things are not necessarily from extraterrestrial sources, but they might actually be native to the planet Earth. Okay, they just exist on other spectra of existence, really. This was tied to his idea of the superspectrum. And he also came up with this concept of window areas, which I think is really interesting when we start to think about things like sacred geography and that kind of thing, which I'm involved in. Okay, so it's clear then that there are two different strands, at least two, maybe let's say three different strands to the study of extraordinary experience. There's the religious studies kind of angle that took off from William James. There's the parapsychological angle that came from the Society for Psychical Research and Experiments. And then there's the Fortean approach, which stems from the work of people like Charles Fort, which is much more expansive and is not so constrained, is able to explore all sorts of things, right from Bigfoot encounters through to alien abductions and everything in between. And even, as we'll see shortly, the places where these phenomena, which we might think of as discrete to begin with, actually overlap with each other as well. So this is what I'm trying to do with the Deep Weird book and also with this symposium, is to think about whether there can be a bridge between these different perspectives, between the academic religious studies, study of extraordinary and religious experiences, the parapsychological experimental approach, and also the popular Fortean perspective as well. And I think there can be a bridge. Okay, so the first point on this bridge is to go right back to the origins, again, like we were saying, of the religious studies kind of approach with William James. Okay, so 1902, 120 years ago, William James gave his Gifford Lectures. The Gifford Lectures are a series of lectures held at Edinburgh University on natural theology. So they were published in 1902 as well. And the title that he chose for his book, I think, is really important: The Varieties of Religious Experience. William James is usually credited as being the guy who solidifies the study of religious experience, who sort of makes it a thing that you can study. Okay, so he's saying that religious experience is a real thing and we can research it. But in the very title of his book, he's saying that it's not just one thing. Religious experience is many, many things. And this is the first kind of jump off point for us to think about high strangeness within this academic kind of scholarly context. Okay, so he's really saying there is not one form of religious experience. There are many forms of religious experience. Okay, so he says, one allies it to the feeling of dependence. One makes it a derivative from fear. Others connect it with the sexual life. Others still identify it with the feeling of the infinite, and so on. Such different ways of conceiving it ought of themselves to arouse doubt as to whether it possibly can be one specific thing. And the moment we are willing to treat the term religious sentiment as a collective name for the many sentiments which religious objects may arouse in alternation, we see that it probably contains nothing whatever of a psychologically specific nature. So he's really saying that although he's delineating this field as something to research, he's actually also saying that it's not one thing. It's many, many things. There's nothing particular about it. Well, actually, there's lots of particular things about it. But he does realize, and he does note, and these are very famous, so you've probably all encountered these before, that there are sort of processes and qualities that connect all of these varieties of experiences together, different forms of religious experience. So, there are many different kinds of experience, but within them, you will often find things like ineffability being a feature of them. Such experiences can't be adequately put into words. They may have a noetic quality, whether we're talking about psychedelic experiences or alien abduction experiences, they impart some kind of a knowledge from an external source to the individual who's having the experience. And, from a religious angle, it might be understood as God, but equally from a paranormal angle, it could be all sorts of different things that you get noetic information from. These experiences are transient. Okay, they're short-lived. They don't necessarily happen continuously. Okay, so whether we're talking about mystical experiences or, again, alien abductions, they might recur throughout life, but it's not one long continuous experience. And the fourth criteria, or the fourth characteristic, is that they're passive, and they feel like they are sort of being done to the experiencer. the experience that it's having an experience and it's coming from outside of the individual. Okay, so what this suggests is that there is both a diversity of experiences, many different kinds of religious experiences, but that they are connected to each other through certain kinds of processes and through certain kinds of qualities and other things, phenomenological features, which we'll talk about shortly. So following on from William James, there's become a sort of a tradition of varieties books. And in the 1960s, the Varieties of Psychedelic Experience was published. And it's important to point out that this was based on just on LSD experiences, and LSD experiences, or LSD, is just one amongst many other kinds of psychedelics as well. So again, it's just a small fraction of the true varieties of psychedelic experience. But even within just LSD experiences, they say it's not possible to say that they are typical. Every such experience is in many significant ways very individual and depends for its structure and content upon what the subject brings to the session in the way of personal history and frame of reference. Okay, so this is like what Timothy Leary and those guys called set and setting, in mindset, and the setting has an influence on the experience. Okay, but they're saying that, there is no, again, just like there's no monolithic religious experience, there is no monolithic psychedelic experience, but many different kinds of psychedelic experiences. But just like James picked up on these noetic, ineffable, and transient qualities, Robert Masters and Jean Houston also picked up on some common sort of themes or threads that run throughout the diversity. So, for instance, many psychedelic experiences will have changes in the way that we experience the body and our body image, in the way that we experience other persons, and in the way that we experience the world of the non-human. So these are themes that are important themes that are really starting to emerge through this, which we'll pick up on it later on as well. And they also include chapters on other themes that recurred in their sample. So there were many sort of iterations of the idea of a voyage inward into the self, lots of sort of imagery, symbolism to do with psyche, the mind, and all of these kinds of things, as well as those traditional religious and mystical kind of features as well, which we're familiar with. Okay, so you can see that although that, again, there's this huge variety of experiences, there are these connecting principles. And then this varieties tradition was carried on into the 21st century by Stanley Krippner and his colleagues with the publication of the Varieties of Anomalous Experience. And here, again, extraordinary experiences expanded out from from religious and spiritual experiences through psychedelic experiences and out to other kinds of things as well. So they say commonly documented sensations and perceptions like synesthesia, lucid dreaming, out-of-body experiences, and auditory and visual hallucinations, all the way through to rarer and more seemingly inexplicable experiences, such as anomalous healing, past lives, near-death mystical experiences, and even alien abductions. Okay, and these have become, or these are really, in here we can see the most common categories, types of experiences that are talked about today, but that are also experienced today. Okay. But this deep weird book that I've been putting together to carry on this lineage is also trying to emphasize this diversity as well as the interconnection. So the point is to say that we can separate these experiences out into all of these neat kinds of categories, but actually in the flux of everyday life of the real world and in real people's experiences, near-death experiences and mystical experiences blur together. Past life experiences and ghost encounters mingle up together, and alien abductions occur alongside poltergeist effects and things like that. Okay, so there is much more diversity, but also much more interconnection than previous, I think, approaches to the varieties I've wanted to face up to. So it's really bringing a Fortean kind of inclusivity to the study of the varieties of anomalous experiences. And that's what we're doing here. So I'm going to think about now then what exactly high strangeness is, where do we get the term from, and why is it actually a useful term for us? Okay, so this is a little bit from Mike Cleland, who we'll hear from later on, but that I think really illustrates what I was just saying about how real world experiences are very often chaotic and complex and have multiple strands in play simultaneously. Okay, so Mike Cleland describes how real life paranormal experiences are often enmeshed in what he calls a tangled knot of implausibility. So really, the idea of a tangled knot, many different strands and processes, and synchronicity spills over the edges like an unattended sink. There's good imagery to think about these real experiences. You couldn't capture them into a neat category. You couldn't necessarily say that it was one thing or the other, but actually it's got many different. But he goes on to say that actually, because this sort of complexity amongst paranormal experiences, real world paranormal experiences, that actually we should take it as a sign to trust the event is actually legitimate. The more complicated the interwoven details, the more valid the experience might actually be. And it sort of, we'll see later on how these very complicated experiences begin to reveal very interesting patterns, not least in the phenomenology of the experiences across a diversity of experiences. Okay, so the more complicated and unusual the experience, the more likely then perhaps it is to be a genuine experience. Okay, so in Fortean writing, this complexity is referred to as the high strangeness factor. Can we get the idea of high strangeness from J. Allen Hynek? He was a researcher of UFOs, maybe even pioneering researcher of UFOs. He was involved in all sorts of top end UFO projects, including famous projects like Project Blue Book, Project Grudge, and he's very famous for his statements about swamp gas and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so as far as in the early days of UFO research, I think Allen Hynek is as sort of mainstream and legitimate a UFO researcher as you can get. And yet he notes that paranormal experiences, well, not just paranormal experiences, UFO experiences are actually often very strange. Very, very strange. Not just simple experiences, but actually complex experiences. So he says, a light seen in the night sky, the trajectory of which cannot be ascribed to a balloon, aircraft, etc., would nonetheless have a low strangeness rating, because there's only one strange thing about the report to explain, its motion. A report of a weird craft that descended within 100 feet of a car on a lonely road, caused the car's engine to die, its radio to stop, and its lights to go out, left marks on the nearby ground, and appeared to be under intelligent control, receives a high strangeness rating, because it contains a number of separate, very strange items, each of which outrages common sense. Okay, so this is our starting definition of high strangeness then. When we have multiple simultaneous baffling phenomena occurring. Jacques Vallée later went on to elaborate 7 stages or 7 levels of strangeness, and they would range all the way through from just seeing a light in the sky right through to the the psychic side of UFO experiences, telepathic communication with extraterrestrials, and all of these kinds of things. Okay, so you can have very simple kinds of experiences, and then you can have very complex kinds of experiences, which would be called high strangeness. Okay, so we can see it's a very, it's a useful, actually, scientific terminology. And it's strange that it's been adopted within, the popular field, but has not really been considered within the scholarly or academic field, even though it comes from scholars and academics. So there are many different reasons why this might be. And George Hansen has suggested that, the paranormal in general has got this trickster-like quality about it. It has a tendency to collapse our neat frameworks and all of these kind of things. So high to be taken seriously within the academy. They're not, you can't, strangeness experiences are not going to catalogue them neatly in a way that you can say distinguish a near-death experience from an out-of-body experience. Maybe that's a bad example. A near-death experience from mediumship, for example. Okay. So the paranormal might have this trickster-like quality going on kind of as a fundamental property of it. And I found a great article that George Hansen wrote about D. Scott Rogo, and he was commenting on D. Scott Rogo's willingness as a psychical researcher to research the stranger reaches of the paranormal as well, to branch out beyond laboratory size studies and into UFOs and things like that. Okay, and he summarizes here, I think, gives a really useful summary of what we mean when we talk about high strangeness. Okay, so he says demonic experiences, Bigfoot sightings, poltergeist action, and phenomena suggesting survival of bodily death have all been reported in conjunction with UFOs. Strange animal mutilations have been reported in poltergeist cases as well as with UFO sightings. Striking ESP experiences have been reported by UFO contactees. Some of the contactees claim bedroom visitations by angels, extraterrestrial aliens, and mythical creatures. Similar experiences have been reported for thousands of years. These are unsettling claims not only because of their innate strangeness, but also because they fall between the discrete categories most people assume to be valid, and thus most researchers, even those in parapsychology, prefer to ignore them. Okay, so they have a very kind of boundary upsetting kind of quality, and real world, this real world complexity of interlocking, interacting experiences doesn't mesh well with the attempt to make things neat and organized. Okay, but there are many, many interconnections, and the Fortean writers are pointing these interconnections out. And I think Joshua Cutchin's books are really, very well put together scholarly books from a popular Fortean perspective, and they open up new vistas for what we might think of as scholarly engagement with the paranormal as well, different angles that we might not have taken into consideration. So, for example, in The Brimstone Deceit, he talks about the role of smells in different paranormal experiences. Okay, so there's a whole, there's lots and lots of writing about things like light and stuff like that, and even sound, but very little has been written about smell. And yet it's a surprisingly common recurrent theme across a whole broad swathe of extraordinary experiences. Most notably the smell of sulfur being associated with all sorts of things, right from ghost experiences through to alien UFO landings and things like that. And the devil. Okay. The Trojan, his book, A Trojan Feast, looks at a whole load of folklore through the lens of the food and the exchange of food that takes place in these experiences. Okay, so it's picking up on interesting things that actually, small interesting things that run through and connect very disparate kinds of experiences. Okay, and like William James and others suggests that there is a whole diversity of things, but there are also certain processes, phenomenological characteristics that link them together. Okay, so although these connections are well attested in the Fortean literature, away from it, it's not true to say that everyone has steered away from it. There are people who have embraced high strangeness, but in general, high strangeness is seen as something that is, I suppose, almost even taboo. Okay. I don't know what's going on with time now. So Now I want to shift our focus. We've explained what high strangeness is from a sort of analytical perspective, from an outsider's point of view. But obviously, high strangeness experiences are experiences, and they are phenomenological event experience. So we need to think about it also from the inside. So what is it like for high strangeness to have a high strangeness experience? And what are some of the characteristics of those experiences? A major one that I have been particularly interested in, I think because actually I have felt this feeling myself um, in psychedelic, in a psych, this feeling of superstitious dread. So this is a nice little quote from the Varieties of Religious Experience. You know, William James was taking these experiences seriously, but he was also pushing the envelope of what we mean by religious experience, because there's nothing in this experience that is particularly religious in a traditional sense. So he's really opening up, although it's labeled as the Varieties of Religious Experience, he's really talking about a whole spread of different kinds of experiences. So he says, this is from his informant, quite early in the night I was awakened. I felt as if I'd been aroused intentionally, and at first thought someone was breaking into the house. I then turned on my side to go to sleep again and immediately felt a consciousness of a presence in the room, and singular to state, it was not the presence of a live person, but of a spiritual presence. I felt also at the same time a strong feeling of superstitious dread, as if something strange and fearful were about to happen. This is a great little quotation, okay? And it comes from this foundational book in the study of religious experiences, okay? This idea of superstitious dread. And Rudolf Otto, writing not too long after William James published The Varieties of Religious Experience, also picked up on this. He noted when in his study of religious experience, and he had a very broad perspective on religious experience as well. Rudolf Otto had traveled through Asia, and he'd seen Buddhism and all sorts of different kinds of religions beyond Christianity. So his understanding of religious experience was also very broad. But again, he saw that there were certain features that it didn't matter what tradition you were dealing with, there were certain kinds of experiences that were recurring. Okay. And he labeled these the experience of the numinous. Okay, so we've probably encountered this term, the numinous, before. He split the numinous up into two parts. And this is another interesting point with all of these things is, we started off talking about the varieties of religious experience, but every time we try to pinpoint something down, it splits in part again. So he labels this thing the numinous, and then he says, actually, there's two parts to this. In fact, he says there are other parts as well. Okay, but the two main parts are the mysterium tremendum. This is the kind of horrifying, awe-inducing spectrum of religious experience where we feel overwhelmed. And then there's the mysterium fascinans, which is the sort of beautiful, attractive, you can't take your gaze off it kind of element of it. So we're saying that religious experiences have got this duality within them between the terrifying and the kind of beautiful. Okay, so again, there's nothing clear cut about any of this. And then he says that this sense of the numinous, of the mysterium tremendum and mysterium fascinans, is sort of induced within us when we encounter or have interactions with what he calls the wholly other. And he defines the wholly other really as something which has no place in our scheme of reality, but belongs to an absolutely different one. So when we encounter something anomalous, maybe a ghost, for example, then this feeling response is triggered. Okay, the feelings response of the numinous, and it can be both terrifying and frightening, terrifying and sort of awe-inspiring and wonderful simultaneously. He says the feeling of it may at times come sweeping like a gentle tide, pervading the mind with a tranquil mood of deepest worship. It may burst in sudden eruption up from the depths of the soul with spasms and convulsions, or lead to the strangest excitements, to intoxicated frenzy, to transport and to ecstasy. It has its wild and demonic forms and can sink to an almost grisly horror and shuddering. It may become the hushed trembling and speechless humility of the creature in the presence of that which is a mystery inexpressible. I love reading that quotation out. Okay. Another way that people describe these kinds of experiences, these very strange experiences, is as weird experiences. Okay. So people might say, you know, I had a very weird experience last night, for instance. Mark Fisher, cultural theorist, focused in on this idea of the weird, and he gave a really useful definition of the weird, which I think blends very nicely with Rudolf Otto's numinous, his idea of the numinous. So he says that the weird is a kind of perturbation. It involves a sensation of wrongness. A weird entity or object is so strange that it makes us feel that it should not exist, or at least it should not exist here. Yet if the entity or object is here, then the categories we have up until now used to make sense of the world cannot be valid. So, you know, the sense of this weird, we can think of it as a feeling response similar to the numinous that emerges or that occurs when we have an encounter with something that is alien, maybe very different. And you know, we can also turn to H.P. Lovecraft. He spent his life writing what he called weird fiction, weird stories, but his definition of the weird, I think, is, you know, almost identical really to the numinous. He says the true weird tale has something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form clanking chains. A certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer unknown forces must be present, and there must be a hint expressed with a seriousness and portentousness becoming its subject of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. So obviously, you know, he's taking it in a very Gothic direction, which is fine by me, but you know, the essence is the same. You know, that we have this feeling response that emerges when we have these kinds of interactions with things that we can't understand. And in this book, Theology and Horror, I suggested that this is kind of one of the unique features of weird fiction, is actually when we read a story like this, you know, like a Lovecraft story, it actually generates within us at least a hint of the experience. We might get, you know, goosebumps and things like that when we're reading. So it's very interesting that it actually, you know, writing and things like that can conjure this weird feeling as well within us. Another term people use to describe these highly strange experiences is surreal. So you might hear people saying that they had a surreal experience, for example. But, you know, if we look at the actual definitions of surreal by the people who, you know, came up with the idea, again, now these are just iterations of ideas, aren't they? But, you know, we turn to André Breton. André Breton was influenced by, you know, Sigmund Freud and the emergence of psychoanalysis and all this kind of stuff, and thinking about the unconscious mind and all Freud's different ways of, you know, bringing unconscious material into the conscious mind. And they thought that they could use these techniques for artistic purposes. So Breton defined surrealism then as psychic automatism in its pure state, by which one proposes to express the actual functioning of thought. Okay, so this is interesting. So if someone says that an experience is surreal, they may not be aware of it, but actually they're suggesting that the experience in some way was blurring or revealing deep structures of thought. Okay, dictated by thought in the absence of any control exercised by reason, exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern. So actually, surreal is a very good definition for these kinds of experiences. And here's the philosopher, and he was the right-hand man of André Breton, Saran Alexandrian. He said that, you know, surrealism was all about reconciling reality with the illogical processes that arise in ecstatic states or in dreams. Okay, so surrealism can't accurately be described as fantasy, but is actually a superior reality in which all of the contradictions which afflict humanity are resolved as in a dream. So if we're saying that an experience is surreal, then we're saying that all of these boundaries and distinctions have been collapsed. Okay, I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to jump forwards a little bit. There's some stuff here about the Oz factor, which again is very similar to the numinous that we talked about earlier. It's an experience that's commonly reported in all sorts of different kinds of paranormal encounters. For example, the Men in Black. I'll read you one very interesting little experience here that I've got. Actually, I'll read you two. This one captures, I think, a lot of these themes that we've been talking about. This was sent to me by someone who's trying to make sense of an encounter that he had as a teenager with his friend in the back garden, or kind of in the scrub at the back of the garden. And he said, both of us immediately saw something out of place. Below, about 30 to 40 feet away from us, in between the trees, there was something tall, white, and three-dimensional. It appeared to be completely white and soft like light, but it did not illuminate the trees or ground around it. It was shaped in an upside-down V or U. It was so white that you could see the shadow being cast on it while it was swaying like it was a real animal. It was making creepy swaying movements with its whole body. It was moving left to right in a specific motion, standing on the forest floor in the same area between the trees, making absolutely no sound, and there was absolutely no wind. It was beautiful to look at, but terrifying at the same time. So there's the numinous there. We watched it in silence as it was swaying, and I started to feel impending doom, and it felt like I was going to die and something bad was going to happen. I told my friend specifically, I don't like this. He agreed, and we immediately left the forest. Okay, and I'll just give you one more very interesting experience that came to me around about the same time that one was sent to me, and I saw so many interesting parallels that the two have become entwined in my mind. This was from one of my students from a couple of years ago. He said, I was around 7 years old when my cousin was staying over for the night. My bed was positioned to the right of the window in my bedroom and the curtains were drawn. My cousin was reading. A strange, deep-toned voice with a kind of distorted resonance sounded from the window, capturing both our attention. My cousin told me not to go. I was too curious and slowly walked towards the window before opening the curtains. In the center of the window was a face of light. The bright light seemed to be pulsating inside the face. It was large enough to engulf the entire center of the window. The mouth began moving and the deep, vibrating, muffled voice started to speak. I was unable to understand most of it and was too in shock to pay close enough attention. I felt locked in place during the event and was in disbelief of what was happening. So super strange experience, that one. Off the wall as it sounds, it has these phenomenological hallmarks. Okay, I think I'll probably have to leave it there. I'll leave it there with the features of highly strange phenomenology.
All right, thank you, Jack. That was a wonderful overview. So I'm gonna use my executive privilege here to put the question that I'm most interested in at the moment. How do we bridge the academic insistence on reproducibility with the fact that a lot of these experiences cannot be reproduced?
Yeah, good question. But I mean, there is within academia, there are other disciplines as well beyond like physics and psychology, which psychology has got a very physics-oriented mindset. But for example, anthropology, deals with stuff that can't be reproduced, and yet is embedded within the academy. So there are other academic perspectives that we can bring to bear that it's not that not interested in the question of whether things are real or not and that kind of thing, or whether they can be reproduced, but maybe are more interested in other elements of it, like the effects on individuals and that kind of thing. And then actually, when you start to think about those kind of things, they do in fact reproduce. And you don't find out about that reproduction in the lab. You actually find out about it by going out into the world and talking to people. So different ways that we can approach, I think, these things that are equally as academic, but that are open, more inclusive.
Ian McDonald asks, thoughts on telling us the difference between unconscious processes as the source of the dread or the numinous? Is it internal fear, not external reality? Just a thought.
Yeah, well, it's difficult to say, isn't it? And like we were saying with the idea of a surreal event, it would be a breakdown of those kinds of categories when it's happening anyway. And perhaps there is no, maybe this is something that I've also been interested in, isn't it? The idea of the ecological self. I did a talk about it a while back. But the idea that in these experiences we have a sort of we have our buffers up around us most of the time, but in these experiences our buffers kind of break down, and we are kind of experiencing openly everything that's around us. So I think that it's actually when those distinctions between internal and objective and external and all that kind of thing break down that we have these most extraordinary experiences. Maybe there is no difference.
Maybe. Jake Glazier asks, the deep weird seems to suggest more of a post-colonial or indigenous perspective. How can we incorporate this as Psi researchers?
Yeah, this is a good question. Yeah, well, one of the things that I think is that could be most kind of useful and put into practice is the adoption of sort of like indigenous research methods. There's a whole field of decolonial approaches to research that's going on, and they're sort of beginning from very different kind of ontological assumptions. So if we just take like spiritual or paranormal things as an example, like the Western scientific approach has been to try to verify these things in a laboratory, to try and basically capture them and put them, whether we're talking about spirits or psi or whatever, to verify them and put a pin through them like a butterfly. Whereas in indigenous perspectives, they're often not to do with capturing things or dissecting them, but actually understanding them within the context within which they occur. Yeah, so thinking about things much more holistically, for instance. So I think bringing like indigenous research methods. My main experience with indigenous research methods has been in trying to find out about people's beliefs and that kind of thing. But I think that in parapsychology, there's definitely be some interesting sort of possibilities for new approaches to experiments, for instance.
I will probably be asking you more about that after this event. I'm fascinated by the idea of looking into indigenous research methods. All right. We barely have time for this, but one more question, just because I think it's a good closer. Scott Tebow would love to hear about personal conclusions in the wake of all this academic understanding. What stands out for you? What disciplines seem worth chasing for the truth seeker? What resonates for you?
My approach that I have ended up in is what I call ontological flooding, which is basically saying that, all of the disciplines, all of the different perspectives have got something to contribute to this. So, whether you're involved in like anthropology or sociology or physics or whatever, music even, you can use the tools of your discipline, whatever it is, to investigate, to do research. So my personal conclusion is actually that we need as many different ways of thinking about these issues as possible. You can't understand something that is complex in simple terms. It doesn't make things easy, but it's perhaps closer to, or will resonate more closely with what's actually going on if we take this kind of complexity, multiple perspectives kind of approach.
Yeah, that's a great place to close.